Her boyfriend, a major general, told her he was getting married. After 5 years together, Jane understood his rules all too well. As a dancer in the military performing arts troupe who spent her life in the public eye, she simply didn't meet the prestigious standards of his family's elite circle. On the night they broke up, they were unnaturally calm. He told her she could keep the small villa provided by the military district, promised that her previously discussed promotion would proceed as planned, and added an extra zero to the balance in her savings account. He asked if there was anything else she wanted. There wasn't. She had already lost everything that mattered. She accepted the severance pay and vanished from his life. 3 months later, during a morale-boosting performance for the local units, another dancer felt Jane's pulse and discovered the secret. When the girl, Sarah, blurted out, "Jane, you're pregnant," the news seemed to sprout legs. Within a single afternoon, it had spread across the entire military district. As Jane walked out of the dressing room, she was immediately surrounded by curious onlookers. People whispered about whether the diagnosis was certain, noting that Sarah's grandfather was a master of traditional medicine and she had studied under him since childhood. A pregnancy pulse was the easiest sign to recognize. She couldn't have been wrong. The word was that she looked to be about 3 months along. Sarah looked at Jane and smiled, asking if she had gotten the timing right. 3 months. Calculating the dates, it would have been the night she and David broke up. Given their positions as a major general and a high-profile performer, they had maintained a tacit agreement regarding birth control for 5 years. Most of the time, he took precautions. On the occasions things went too far, Jane would reliably take the morning after pill. That final night, perhaps because they both knew it was the end, they had been reckless, staying up all night long and moving from the bedroom to the bathroom and then to the study without restraint. Afterward, Jane had immediately left to join the troupe for their tour. In the whirlwind of the busy schedule, she had completely forgotten to buy the medication. Facing Sarah, who was still waiting for an answer, Jane pulled her wrist away and ignored her. Given Jane's current status in the troupe, she didn't feel the need to give the girl the time of day. The instructor stepped in to smooth things over, awkwardly changing the subject. Once the performance ended, Jane climbed into a military-plated SUV. A staff officer from the troupe held a phone up to her face, showing the internal military district forums. The threads were already several pages deep with eye-catching headlines. Jane Miller is pregnant, who is the father of Jane's child, and Jane and David Reed. David had always been low-key, as a man of his rank lived by strict discipline. The only exception was the way he championed Jane's career. He had wanted the entire military district to know she had backing, and that her backing was him. It all started during her first year in the troupe, when a veteran choreographer had used rehearsals as an excuse to make life difficult for her. He had insulted her in front of the entire company, claiming her frame was too stiff and her form was poor, forcing her to practice basic drills for an entire afternoon until her knees were bruised purple. Being young and naive, Jane had assumed she was truly lacking and didn't feel wronged. David, however, had been both furious and heartbroken when he found out, calling her a fool. The very next day, that choreographer was transferred to a remote border unit. When Jane had whispered her concerns about him offending someone so senior, David had replied nonchalantly that it was the person behind the choreographer who should worry about offending him. Over the last 5 years, David had spared no effort in pouring resources into her. She held the center position in every major military showcase, led the teams for morale tours, and even when she joined the cultural formation for the National Day Parade, division commanders would reflexively make way for her. David used to say, his Jane deserved to live in the spotlight. She had lived up to his efforts, becoming a household name and a pillar of the troupe. However, her current fame also meant that the news of her pregnancy would almost certainly reach David's ears. Sure enough, just as she arrived back at the military compound, his phone call came through almost immediately. Jane stared at the familiar string of digits, a number she knew by heart, and let it ring until it cut off automatically. Once it went silent, she sent him 3 consecutive text messages. "I'm going to the hospital for an exam tomorrow. If I am pregnant, I'll take care of it. Don't worry, I won't cause any trouble for you." It was already March, and the snow was still falling. This kind of heavy, swirling blizzard made it impossible not to remember her first meeting with David. She had been 19 at the time, a sophomore in college. He was the kind of person even the university leadership scrambled to please. Jane had been chosen to attend a formal dinner, essentially to serve as eye candy for the guests. Her personal stakes were high. She was vying for a solo spot in the All-Army Cultural Showcase. After a few rounds of Muay Thai, the men who usually carried themselves with such dignity dropped their masks and began heckling her to drink hard liquor. David was sitting in the seat of honor, his fingers tapping the table with casual indifference. "That's enough," he said. "Don't bully the girl." It was a simple, flat remark, yet no one dared to pour her another drop. Jane looked up in a daze just as he happened to look over. Amidst the sounds of flattery and laughter, their eyes met for a fleeting second. She thanked him for the small act of kindness, but didn't give it much thought afterward. Deep down, she never imagined a man like him would ever cross paths with her again. Yet, after that day, he began appearing in her life frequently, acting as her savior. When the vice dean's daughter stole her solo opportunity, David got it back for her with a single sentence. On a snowy night, when she practiced in the studio until dawn and couldn't find a taxi back to the dorms, he personally drove his military vehicle to pick her up. When her father needed surgery and the hospital was out of type O blood, a man of David's high status rolled up his sleeve and donated 400 milliliters without a second thought. He was too good to her, so good that she became afraid. She feared he was just filling a void of desire or playing with her emotions on a whim. Jane was the one who finally broke the tension. "What do you want?" she had asked, looking at him coldly as she forcefully unfastened the buttons of her dance costume. "Is it for me to sleep with you? We'll be even after we're done." David had sighed softly and pulled her clothes back together. "Jane, what is it that you want?" Her eyelashes trembled as she forced herself to look into his eyes. "I want the kind of love that can survive on nothing but water," she said, stressing every word. "Can you give me that?" David paused, a trace of a smile touching the corners of his lips. He kissed the tips of her fingers, his voice dropping to a heart-stopping register. "I can." He hadn't been lying. He truly gave her the love she craved. But love wasn't a cure-all. Neither he nor she had fully considered the gap between them. Social class was an unbridgeable chasm, a distance she couldn't erase no matter how hard she climbed. The day they broke up, the city saw its first snow of the year. The night before, they had been tangled together from the bedroom to the bathroom to the study, holding on as if their lives depended on it. He cooked dinner himself, and once she finished eating, he said, "I'm getting married." Jane froze for several seconds before putting down her chopsticks. "Okay," she replied. A long silence followed. The food on the table had turned cold by the time he spoke again. "That villa is yours. The promotion I promised is still yours. I added another 0 to the savings account. Is there anything else you want?" Jane told him there wasn't. David nodded, turned, and walked out into the snowy night. Watching his retreating figure, Jane felt a sudden wave of regret. After so many years together, she realized she had never actually told him, "I love you," out loud. These 5 years had passed too quickly, so quickly that they had walked through storm after storm together, mistakenly believing they would grow old together. She had mistakenly believed there would always be another chance to speak her heart. It was such a shame. The snow fell harder, and as David's back disappeared at the edge of her vision, her sight blurred. Jane felt a dull coldness on her face and reached up to wipe away the tears. Jane only realized then that those cold droplets were tears. Unsurprisingly, her life in the military performing arts troupe became difficult after that. News of David's engagement to a daughter from a prestigious military family had been unearthed, and in an instant, Jane became the target of everyone's judgment and gossip. "Jane, are you doing okay?" Sarah asked, sauntering into the rehearsal room in her dance shoes while the rest of the troupe was frantically trying to figure out how to handle the scandal. Sarah's visit was a blatant show of force. As colleagues in the same troupe, Jane had personally mentored her when she first joined, never expecting a modern-day retelling of the fable of the farmer and the viper. Sarah's confidence didn't stem from her dancing skills, which were the laughingstock of the troupe, but from the fact that she had hooked up with a distant cousin of David's fiancé. Jane wondered if this little stunt was Sarah's own idea, or if she was acting on orders from the other side. If it was the former, Jane still had a chance to turn things around. But if the fiancé's family wanted her gone, she would be completely defenseless. To be a suitable match for the Reed family, the other side had to be incredibly prominent. With someone backing her up, Sarah's arrogance grew even more heated. She leaned in and whispered in Jane's ear, "Jane Miller, did you really think the Major General could protect you forever? No matter how much he spoiled you in the past, that woman is the one he's officially marrying. As for you," she paused, her smile dripping with mockery, "you're nothing but a dirty little secret." That label made Jane lift her gaze to look at her. Sarah wouldn't let it go. The lady asked me to give you a message. She's a very generous person and can tolerate women on the outside, but she won't tolerate a bastard on the outside. If you're smart, you'll get an abortion before she has to handle it personally." Jane looked down, casually admiring the calluses on her fingertips from years of practice, not even giving the girl a glance. "You can give her a message for me too," Jane replied. "Tell her that her taste in lapdogs is absolutely pathetic." Sarah was so enraged by Jane's contemptuous attitude that she began to stomp her feet. "Jane, just you wait. You're going to be exiled to the border units for morale tours," Jane replied calmly. "I'll be waiting." On the surface, she remained unbothered, but internally, she had already braced herself to be blacklisted. Having spent 5 years in that social circle, she knew all too well that even a star performer in the prestigious troupe was, to a true elite family, merely someone who sang and danced for entertainment during the holidays. For them to crush her wouldn't be much harder than crushing an ant. And David, there was no way David would openly clash with his fiancée's family for her sake. He did spoil her, and one could even say he loved her, but for a man like him, love carried very little weight in the grand scheme of things. To her surprise, the next morning, a staff officer from the troupe informed her that all the posts about her had been deleted overnight. In their place was a notice of public criticism against Sarah. Jane was taken aback. That cold, ruthless efficiency was unmistakably David's handiwork. Was this his way of compensating her for the upcoming surgery? However, as she looked down at the single red line on the pregnancy test, the corner of her mouth twisted in a ridiculous smirk. She wasn't pregnant. Yet, her period hadn't come in 3 months. Was she pregnant or not? Jane stared at the test for a long time before deciding to trust science and go to the hospital for a proper checkup. What she didn't expect was that just as she finished her ultrasound and was waiting in the corridor for her report, a pack of reporters who had caught her scent suddenly swarmed her. Cameras and microphones were shoved into her face as the questions became increasingly sharp. "Miss Miller, is Major General Reed the father of the child? Was Sarah's public reprimand this morning the Major General's way of venting his anger for you? What exactly is your relationship with Major General Reed? Is it the kind of relationship people are whispering about? It's been said that the Major General is already engaged to someone else. A wedding date has been set for the near future. Ms. Miller, how do you feel about your current status?" The hospital corridor was completely blocked, packed with people. The flashbulbs stung Jane's eyes. She offered only a single sentence. "I am under no obligation to explain my private life to the public." Is it that you don't want to explain, or is it that you actually have no idea who the father is? A man wearing a hat spoke with a voice full of malice. "I've heard things get pretty wild in your performance troupe. Tell us, Miss Miller, have you ever attended any private parties? You know, the kind where a group of people drinks together until dawn?" A wave of nausea rolled through Jane's stomach. The disgust hit her so hard she couldn't stop herself from retching. The crowd went wild. They pointed their lenses directly at her face, ensuring they captured every micro-expression of her gagging. "Is that how the baby was conceived, Ms. Miller?" Thwack! A cell phone flew through the air, striking the man squarely on the forehead. Blood began to flow instantly as the phone's screen shattered into pieces. Clutching his bleeding head, the man began to swear violently. "Who the hell threw that at me?" A voice rang out, loud and clear. Everyone in the hallway gasped. Jane's entire body froze. She subconsciously lifted her gaze, looking through the chaotic crowd to meet a pair of dark, cold, and piercing eyes. David stood there in his standard military uniform, the general's star on his shoulder straps glinting under the corridor lights. That aura of high-ranking authority forced the crowd to instinctively part, carving a path for him. He looked at Jane, his black military boots clicking against the floor as he walked toward her, step by step. Jane gripped her fingers so hard her knuckles turned white. Right then, the clinic door clicked open. The doctor stepped out, glanced at the chaotic, yet eerily silent crowd, and looked down at Jane. "Miss Miller, your lab results are ready." The doctor's voice wasn't loud, but it felt like a stone dropped into stagnant water, making everyone present hold their breath in anticipation. Jane instinctively looked at David. He stood there, the star on his shoulder cold and blinding, but his gaze was fixed on her hand, the one clutching the report. She had seen that look many times before. 5 years ago, on that snowy night when he drove her back to the dorms, he had looked at her red, frozen fingers with that exact expression, pained yet restrained. "The child isn't yours." Jane didn't know why those words blurted out of her mouth. Perhaps she wanted to draw a clear line between them, or perhaps she just wanted him to feel at ease so he could go through with his wedding. David didn't say a word. He simply walked over and draped a heavy military overcoat across her shoulders. The fabric still carried the warmth of his body. "Give me the report," he said, reaching out toward the doctor. The doctor hesitated for a moment before handing it over. David looked down at the paper for a few seconds, then folded it expressionlessly and tucked it into his pocket. "Come with me." It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. He turned to walk out, and the crowd automatically moved aside to let him through. Jane stood her ground, refusing to move until he looked back at her. For a split second, his eyes held a flash of exasperation. "Jane, don't make me say it twice." Jane followed him and climbed into the familiar military-plated SUV. The moment the door slammed shut, the clamor of the outside world was cut off. The interior of the vehicle was so quiet they could hear each other breathing. The driver discreetly raised the privacy partition. "The report says," David began, his voice very low, "that you aren't pregnant." Jane leaned back against the seat and didn't respond. "But your hormone levels are abnormal," he continued. "Your endometrial lining is thickened, and there is a cyst on your ovary. The doctor recommends further testing to rule out the possibility of a serious illness." David read the medical terminology from the report with a flat, level voice, as if he were delivering an official work briefing. "And then what?" Jane asked. "And then, I'm taking you to the General Military Hospital for a comprehensive exam." "That won't be necessary," Jane replied, turning her head to stare out the window. "I can go by myself." "Go by yourself?" David suddenly let out a short laugh, his expression colored by an unidentifiable emotion. "You think you could have handled a situation like the one back there on your own?" Jane remained silent for a moment, before suddenly asking, "Was it you who ordered the public reprimand for Sarah?" "No." Jane turned back to look at him. David kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, the lines of his profile cold and rigid. "The order came directly from the top. The military district political department determined that public harassment and exclusion of a fellow comrade within the troop was an act of gross misconduct. They felt it had a terrible influence and had to be dealt with severely." Jane was stunned. "It wasn't your doing?" "My doing?" He paused for a beat. "Jane, I'm not your backing anymore. Have you forgotten?" Those words felt like a bucket of ice water being poured over her head. He was right. They had broken up. He no longer had any obligation to protect her. Then why had he shown up at the hospital today? As if reading the question in her mind, David spoke again. "The political department received a report that someone was intentionally slandering the image of a military artist. I was ordered to come and handle it." "They sent you to handle it?" "I happened to be in a meeting nearby today." Whether it was a coincidence or merely an excuse, they both tacitly chose not to speak of it further. Outside the car window, the snow continued to fall. The examination at the General Military Hospital went smoothly. David didn't accompany her inside. He simply parked the car and told her, "Find me when you're finished." Watching his silhouette, Jane suddenly found the situation a bit darky humorous. They were broken up, yet he was still acting like this. Was it because he couldn't let go? Or was it just the force of habit? The results wouldn't be ready for 2 days. By the time Jane stepped out of the hospital, it was nearly dark. David's car was still parked in the same spot. He was leaning back in the driver's seat with his eyes closed, and she couldn't tell if he was asleep or lost in thought. She tapped on the window. He opened his eyes, a flicker of exhaustion crossing his gaze. "Get in," he said. "No thanks, I'll just catch a cab back." "Jane," he called her name, his voice sounding a bit raspy. "Get in." She didn't refuse a second time. Neither of them spoke a word during the drive. When the car pulled up in front of the small villa where she lived, Jane unbuckled her seatbelt, preparing to get out. "Jane," he called out again. She stopped but didn't turn around. "About night?" His voice was very soft, almost as if he were talking to himself. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Jane's hand tightened around the door handle. "I know. If you want to yell at me, you can. I'm not going to yell at you," she said. "David, you don't owe me anything. From the very beginning, I knew we would never have a future together. 5 years was enough." She pushed the door open and stepped out. The snow had stopped. Behind her, she heard the sound of the car door opening and closing, followed by footsteps. "Jane." She turned around and saw David standing by the vehicle. Snowflakes landed on his shoulders, melting into dark water spots. "When the report comes out, no matter what the result is, tell me, okay?" Jane gave a small nod and walked into the villa. She closed the door and slowly slid down until she was sitting on the floor with her back against the wood. It wasn't until the tears started falling that she realized she was shaking. 2 days later, Jane went to pick up her medical report. The doctor told her it wasn't a major issue, it's just a phantom pregnancy caused by a hormonal imbalance. With medication, a regulated schedule, and a better diet, she would slowly recover. However, the doctor looked at her and said, "Miss Miller, your body has been in a state of chronic, extreme exhaustion for a long time," the doctor continued. "If you keep going like this, it won't just affect your dance career, it will impact your fertility as well." Jane nodded, taking the prescription as she prepared to leave. "Wait a moment," the doctor called out, hesitating. "I shouldn't overstep, but have you been under significant emotional stress lately?" Jane didn't answer. The doctor sighed. "Many physical problems have their roots in the heart. You need to take care of yourself." Upon leaving the hospital, Jane sent David a text. "The test results are fine. Nothing to worry about." He replied instantly with a simple, "Understood." Just 3 words. Clean and efficient, exactly like the man himself. Holding her phone, Jane stood at the hospital entrance, suddenly unsure of where to go. Rehearsals at the troupe had been suspended under the guise of rectifying conduct, and all her performance assignments had been canceled. The official reason was that she needed rest, but in plain terms, she had been blacklisted. And this time, David wasn't coming to fix it for her. She took a cab back to the villa, changed into her practice clothes, and spread a mat across the living room floor to start stretching. Dancing was her life. From the time she started at 5 years old to meeting David at 19 to their breakup at 24, her world had revolved around only 2 things: dancing and him. Now that he was gone, she couldn't afford to lose dancing too. She went through her stretches, backbends, splits, and pirouettes over and over until she was drenched in sweat and collapsed onto the mat. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from a staff officer at the troupe. "Jane, Sarah has been transferred to the Border Region Cultural Team. She leaves tomorrow." Jane stared at the message for a long time. Sarah being sent to the border meant her dance career was essentially over. The conditions there were harsh. Performance opportunities were rare, and the path to promotion was narrow. Once you were sent there, it was nearly impossible to return. Whose handiwork was this? David's, or his fiancée's family? If it was David, why would he do it? They had already broken up. He had no reason to stand up for her anymore. If it was the other side, it made even less sense. Sarah was their person. Why would they exile one of their own? She couldn't wrap her head around it, so she simply stopped trying. Either way, it had nothing to do with her. For the next few days, Jane stayed confined in the villa. She spent her time practicing, taking her medication, eating, and sleeping. Her days were as regular as clockwork, almost frighteningly so. Occasionally, colleagues from the troupe would send messages to check in, and she would always reply that she was fine. Finally, on the 7th day, her instructor called. "Jane, there's a morale-boosting performance for the grassroots units next week. Do you want to go?" "I'm allowed to go?" Jane asked. The instructor went silent for a moment. "The higher-ups specifically requested you by name." "Which higher-ups?" "I'm not entirely sure. The notice came directly from the political department. Get yourself ready. The program list for the performance has already been sent to your email." After hanging up, Jane opened her inbox. Her name was at the very top of the program list for a solo performance, the Flying Apsaras. This was a dance she had choreographed during her first year with David. It had won the gold medal at the All-Army Cultural Showcase. Back then, he had told her, "Why, Jane looks like a goddess when she dances." Whose idea was it for her to perform this piece now? After a moment of thought, Jane dialed David's number. It rang 3 times before he picked up. "What is it?" he asked, his voice very clipped. "Did you request me for the morale performance?" "No." "Then do you know who did?" "I know who it was. It was my fiancé." Jane's hand tightened around the phone. "She requested for me to perform the Flying Apsaras? She wants to see you," David said. He paused for a beat before adding, "Jane, you don't have to go. I can handle this." "I'm going," Jane interrupted him. "Jane?" "David," she said, cutting him off again. "I can't hide forever. If she wants to see me, then we'll see each other." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Fine," he finally said. "I'll be there on the day of the performance." "You don't need to." "I'll be there." He hung up the phone. The morale performance was held at a base in the northwest. Jane took a 6-hour flight followed by a 2-hour bus ride to reach the site. The base sat on the Gobi Desert, surrounded by an endless expanse of yellow sand. The wind was so strong it was hard to keep one's eyes open. The performance was scheduled in the base's grand auditorium, with the audience consisting of the officers and soldiers stationed there. Jane finished her makeup, changed into her dance costume, and stood behind the curtain, waiting for her cue. "Miss Miller?" A strange female voice called out from behind her. Jane turned around. A woman stood at the entrance to the backstage area, dressed in civilian clothes. She had a striking presence, While her features weren't necessarily breathtaking, there was an innate air of nobility in her eyes. Two men in black jackets stood behind her, clearly bodyguards. "I'm David's fiancée, Catherine," she said, walking closer. She looked Jane up and down, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I've heard a lot about you." "A pleasure, Miss Sterling," Jane replied with a nod. "I've heard about your flying Apsara's dance," Catherine said, sitting down in a nearby chair. "I've always wanted to see it in person. Today I finally have the chance." Jane didn't respond. "You don't need to be nervous," Catherine continued. "I requested you specifically, but not to make things difficult for you. I just wanted to see what kind of woman could stay in David's heart for 5 years." "You must be joking, Miss Sterling," Jane said. "The one in the Major General's heart is you, not me." "Is that so?" She smiled. "Then why do you think he's here today?" Jane froze. "He's here? You didn't know?" Catherine tilted her chin slightly. "He's sitting in the 3rd row. He flew all the way from the capital, a 6-hour flight, just to watch you perform one dance." Jane's heart skipped a beat. "Jane," Catherine said, standing up and walking over to her. "The marriage between David and me was arranged by our families. He wasn't willing, I know that, but he didn't refuse either." She looked at Jane, her gaze calm. "For people like us, marriage is never a personal matter. Whether you love him or he loves you, none of that is important. What matters is whether or not you can actually be together." She paused. "You can't, so please let him go." The curtain rose. The lights flared to life and the music began to play. Jane walked onto the stage and saw David sitting in the 3rd row. He was in uniform, sitting perfectly upright. His gaze pierced through the stage lights and settled on her. There was too much in that look. Longing, restraint, heartache, helplessness, and love. As the music flowed, Jane spun and leapt. Every movement felt like a sentence spoken aloud. "I still love you. I'm sorry. Please forget me." As the dance reached its end, Jane knelt on the stage, her arms reaching upward as if she were trying to fly toward the sky. The lights dimmed. Thunderous applause erupted throughout the hall. Jane stood up, bowed, and made her exit. Behind the stage, Catherine Sterling was already gone. After changing back into her regular clothes, Jane stepped out of the auditorium. The wind on the Gobi Desert was howling, blowing so fiercely she could barely keep her eyes open. "Jane?" She turned around. David was standing in the wind, his overcoat snapping loudly against the gale. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "I'm taking you back." "No thanks. There's a bus provided for us." "Jane?" He walked toward her until he was standing directly in front of her. "What did Catherine say to you?" "Nothing," Jane replied. "She was right, though. I should let you go, and you should let me go." David remained silent for a long time. The wind whipped between them, swirling the yellow sand into the air. "I don't want to let you go," he said suddenly. Jane looked up at him. "Jane, I don't want to get married." His voice was incredibly low. "I don't want to marry Catherine Sterling. I don't want to break up with you. I don't want you going to the hospital all by yourself. I don't want—" "David," she interrupted him. "What you want doesn't matter. What you can do is what matters." "What if I can?" Jane froze. "What if I can marry you?" He looked at her intently. "Jane, will you marry me?" The wind on the desert seemed to stop instantly. The entire world became as still as a painting. Jane stared into David's eyes, the eyes she had looked into for 5 years. "What did you say?" "I said," he took her hand in his, "Jane, marry me." "Your engagement, you called it off?" "I did," he said, "the day before yesterday." Jane couldn't believe her ears. "Why?" "Because I don't want to spend the rest of my life in regret," David said. "Jane, I've lived for 36 years. I've made many decisions, and I've never regretted a single one. But breaking up with you, I regretted that. That night when I said I was getting married and you just said okay, I thought you really didn't care. I thought you had never loved me. Then, when you were cornered by those people at the hospital, and I saw you standing there all alone, I realized I couldn't live without you. I called off the wedding. I've offended both families, and it might even affect my career. But Jane, I don't care." He looked at her, his eyes slightly rimmed with red. "I only care about you." When the tears began to fall, Jane didn't wipe them away. "David, you're crazy. Maybe. You'll regret this. I won't." "How can you be so sure?" "Because," he pulled her into his arms and held her tight, "the most certain thing in my life is that I love you." The wind rose again, and the desert sand filled the air, blurring her vision. Jane buried her face in his chest and cried like a child. "Jane," his voice came from above her, "come home with me." She lifted her head and looked into his eyes. "Okay." A year later, at the military compound in the capital, Jane stood before a mirror in her wedding dress. Looking at her reflection, she found it hard to believe that today was the day she would finally marry David. "Nervous?" Catherine Sterling stood behind her, helping to adjust her veil. "A little." "Don't be," Catherine smiled. I'm not even nervous, so why should you be? It was true. Catherine Sterling was serving as her bridesmaid. If anyone heard that story, they wouldn't believe it. After David called off the engagement, Catherine didn't make a scene or cause a stir. She simply went to meet with David once for a discussion. No one knew what they spoke about, but later, she took the initiative to find Jane. David and I grew up together, and I always assumed we would get married, Catherine told her. But later, I realized something. I don't want to marry a man who doesn't love me. You stole my fiancé, so I should hate you. But then I watched you perform the flying apsaras, and I suddenly understood why David chose you. When you're on that stage, you're glowing. From then on, they became friends. The wedding was held in the auditorium of the military compound. Not many people attended, only their closest family and friends. David stood on the stage in his military uniform, the general's star on his shoulder straps shimmering under the lights. He watched Jane walk down the red carpet, a light in his eyes. That light was exactly the same as it had been 5 years ago when he had stepped in to help her at that dinner. "Jane," he said, his voice choking up slightly as he took her hand. "Thank you for being willing to marry me." Jane looked at him and replied, "David, thank you for being willing to marry me." Applause rang out from the audience. Outside the window, the snow began to fall again. It was a heavy snow, just like the one 5 years ago, but this time they wouldn't lose their way. After the wedding ended, Jane sat in their new home scrolling through her phone. A staff officer from the troupe had sent her a message. "Jane, the All-Army Cultural Showcase starts next month. Your Flying Apsaras has been selected as the opening act. Congratulations." She smiled and texted back a thank you. David walked over and sat down beside her. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "Nothing," she said, putting down her phone and leaning against his shoulder. "Jane? I love you." Jane lifted her head and looked into his eyes. She had waited 6 years to hear those words. "I love you too," she replied. Outside, the snow fell harder and harder, but inside the house, it was as warm as spring.
The story of Jane and David ends here. After all the storms, misunderstandings, and family pressure, they finally found their happiness together. What I love most is how David had the courage to stand up and fight for their love, and how Jane always kept her dignity and strength through everything. True love really requires a lot of courage. The courage to love, the courage to let go, and the courage to come back when you realize you were wrong. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the story, please give it a like and subscribe to support the channel. See you in the next video. Love you all so much!